It's true. Across the globe, women aren't as prosperous as men. Gender inequality is a pressing moral issue, but we forget it has massive economic implications. If you were to put all of the women who don't have access to formal financial services in one place, they would make up the third largest country in the world. That means an entire population without bank accounts, credit cards, or other tools you and I likely benefit from daily. Prosperity for women starts with inclusive policies, products, and people around the globe, and the investment to make it happen. Welcome to the Making Finance Work for Women podcast. My name is Sonia Kelly, and I lead Women's World Banking's proprietary research division. Join me as I speak with changemakers around the globe to deconstruct the social and economic exclusion women face. We'll discover new evidence together and drive action to accelerate women's economic empowerment. Because a leg up isn't a handout, it's a global game changer. Welcome and thank you so much for tuning in to the Making Finance Work for Women podcast, which is now streaming on YouTube and available wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Sonia Kelly. If you're listening on YouTube, you'll be able to find additional insights and resources that we link in the description of the video below. We have a lot of new listeners, so maybe it's time for some quick notes on the show. This is a show that's designed for anyone who's curious about or wants to learn more about women's financial inclusion. I've heard of policymakers, financial services providers, people from startups, people who work at multilaterals, civil society, and even my own mother enjoying the show. Hi, Mom. I'm the host of the show, Sonia Kelly, as I said, and my day job is serving as the global head of the Women's World Banking Institute. Now, our format is simple. I offer a quick overview of an issue, and then we bring a guest on to discuss it. Now, before we get started today, I'd like to give a special shout out to the sponsor of the Making Finance Work for Women podcast, which is Ernst & Young LLP. EY is a global leader working across assurance, consulting, law, strategy, tax, and transactions. EY teams ask better questions to find new answers for the complex issues facing our world today. You can visit their website at ey.com to explore their latest insights and services. Now let's jump into the show. We're going to focus today on the importance of women's leadership for solving the climate crisis that MSMEs, or micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises around the world are facing, and particularly women-led MSMEs. We know that 753 million women in climate-vulnerable countries do not have an active bank account or e-wallet. We also know that 880 million women would not have a way to receive emergency support payments after a severe weather event. And finally, we know, and this is really important, we know that 840 million women in climate vulnerable countries would find it difficult or impossible to cover the cost of an emergency. In terms of the proportion of women living in those countries, if we compare climate vulnerable countries the rest of the world, we see greater financial exclusion in climate vulnerable countries than we see outside of climate vulnerable countries. We see that the climate crisis really is a women's financial inclusion problem. The division I run at Women's World Banking, which is the Women's World Banking Institute, just did some data analysis that contributes to our new global publication on this topic. So if you heard those numbers and you're like, where do those come from? I want to learn more. There's a link in the comments in the YouTube, or you can just Google it. You can look it up under Women's World Banking, Finance, Climate, and Gender, and you'll find that publication. I'd love to share more about it, but I also want to talk about solutions and just jump right to there instead of dwelling on the data, because one of the biggest solutions that we see to this problem is women's leadership. Now, in the workplace, women's leadership is associated with increased transparency regarding environmental footprints, and a higher percentage of women on a corporate board is known to correlate positively with the proper disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions. A critical mass of women on a board leads not only to better climate outcomes, but also to more innovation. And that's why gender diversity is so important at that leadership level. Now, if we talk about the political level, we have policymakers listening. At the political level, research shows clear linkages between women's leadership and action to tackle climate change. For example, there's a study that found that countries with higher proportions of women in parliament are more likely to ratify international environmental treaties and have stricter climate policies. If we talk about business, we can see that in the literature, it says gender diverse firms tend to have better environmental reporting and climate governance than their peers who don't have gender diversity in those firms. They make more investments in renewable power generation and energy efficiency improvement. And in the literature, what's really cool that we see is that these relationships are causal. It's not happenstance. It's not just by coincidence. These relationships are actually causal. Now, I personally have had 3 conversations in the last couple weeks in which women who were involved with board governance have reported that the board they're working with complains they just can't find women board members, which is a big problem. And it's something we're going to talk about today with our guest. In the context of all of this, I'm more and more convinced that gender equality is the most urgent climate action of all. Women decision makers have unique strengths to contribute to the leadership of organizations and boards. So I'm thrilled to introduce our guest to you now because as a woman leader working with boards and companies to make wise and impactful decisions, she is someone who has firsthand experience on this topic of women's leadership in times of crisis. She's also someone I've known for many years and have wanted to have on the podcast since we began. So welcome, Buhle. Buhle Goslar is a financial technology leader with over 20 years of experience driving innovation across sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, and Asia. If you've been in the financial inclusion space, I'm really confident that you've seen her name somewhere. He was the former CEO of Jumo for the Africa region and has worked across financial services, technology, retail, and tourism. She sits on countless boards, well, I mean, not countless, but many boards and executive committees, including Lula, Aseli Africa, and CGAP. And that's just to name a few. Those are the ones I'm most excited about and familiar with. She's a strong female leader, and I'm delighted that an expert like her is in the fight with us for women's financial inclusion. Welcome, Buhle.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that very generous introduction.
Yeah, absolutely. We always like to start our episode by asking our guests what their origin story is. So you've been doing a lot of things. What brought you to the women's financial inclusion space?
Yeah, super interesting question. That always makes me feel like a superhero origin story.
Absolutely. I mean, you are. So
Yeah, I'll take that. I'm not sure whether I found financial inclusion and gender equity as a space or if it found me. But I think, reflecting on this, I certainly think that everything from just my upbringing kind of conspired to make this type of work really appealing to me, right? And what I mean by that is from very early on, I was, for various reasons, a witness to tribal discrimination, racial discrimination, gender discrimination. And at the same time, my parents were just incredible advocates for me. And, they just saw the opportunities as limitless for me. And I think a huge testament to that is for years, they let me believe that I could be president. They never once brought up, the various impediments that might exist in the context in which we were living, right? So, and I think from that I took inspiration around standing up for the voiceless, not allowing people to be cheated out of opportunity because of structural issues and so on. So that's just like fun background context. But in terms of career, it's been an interesting and somewhat winding path. After I scaled down my ambitions from president, I spent some
I
time
would vote
working.
for you. Let me just say, if you did run for president and we were in the same country and I were allowed to vote for you, I would vote for you.
Thank you. So scaled down ambitions from president, ended up starting a career in travel tech, worked in private banking, wealth management, into retail, financial services, before ultimately ending up in fintech. And I think, as I went through that journey, at each phase I was able to learn things which are still useful to me today. I think the time that I spent working in travel and tourism really opened up my eyes around what it takes to drive economic inclusion. I did a lot of work there in bringing in what were then micro and small SMEs in South Africa into what was one of the largest and most lucrative industries, right? I think at the moment it's probably about 8% of our GDP, something like that. So that was important, understanding how you can kind of shift the structure of an industry. And we were using technology as well as part of that. My time in private banking and wealth management was interesting. I sometimes call it years in the wilderness, but certainly it did, I think, give me an appreciation of what capital can do. I got a lot of exposure to philanthropy, the benefits and limitations of it in changing people's lives, right? What's efficient, what's not, who accumulates wealth, who doesn't. And I think it was hugely impactful in shaping my thinking, that early on in my career. Retail financial services I loved, and is actually ultimately what kind of brought me to fintech, because I was able to see that access to financial tools, you know, is a can be life changing. But at the same time, as I worked in data driven marketing, product, and so on. I also started to see the limitations when technology is not applied in a really meaningful way, right? And funny enough, I was working on my dissertation for my MBA, and that led to me having a meeting with a person who was the founder of the leading lending fintech on the continent. And that coffee turned into a job, which turned into the rest of my career, right?
Wow,
Yeah,
wow.
yeah. So a winding path, but one where things came together in the end.
Mm. I really like your description of your winding path, because something that I've always appreciated about you is your deep understanding of customers, what they'll pay for, how to make a sustainable business, and like you said, like what's efficient, what works. But that's what I know you most for. But also hearing about your deep understanding of vulnerability and your knowledge of the tech space makes you just like a really excellent leader. So you're not just somebody who does good customer research, you're also somebody who understands what's behind customer needs, and then also what technology makes it possible to address them. And that's what I think makes you a really impressive leader, as I've followed your journey. Now, we talk a lot at Women's World Banking about the value of women's leadership. I mentioned a few pieces of research in my introduction, but how would you personally articulate the value of women on boards or in leadership positions?
Mm. Yeah. So I'm going to answer that question, but I did an interesting exercise where I looked up what is the value of men on boards. So Google that, invite the audience to do that on one tab, and then Google what is the value of women on boards. So, spoiler, what you find is that what is the value of men on boards actually talks about reasons to diversify your board. It doesn't actually it doesn't give you any substantiation apart from that. What is the value of women on boards gives you in-depth research on how women on boards can lead to better financial results. Transparency, I think, is one you mentioned, sustainability, and so on. And I found that interesting, that the literature teaches us that the justification is required for women's participation, but not for men's. And I'll leave that there for the audience to ponder and really just think about what some of the risks in that might be. That said, I do think that women do bring incredible value onto the board, and a lot of what is talked about in the literature, and certainly what I observe, I think can be attributed to how we are socialized, right? So to get through in the world, you have to collaborate. For most women, you have to be empathetic, because there is a lot of emotional labor that you do and are expected to do for your family and for your community. And interestingly, I think all of those are things which really lend themselves well to leading in the sustainability space, right? Because you have to park the win at all cost mentality at the door when you look at sustainability issues. And instead, you have to think about all of the stakeholders. And you have to think about stakeholders who may not have wealth, but they have value, right? And we learn this when we kind of look at sustainability and climate issues, where when it comes to maintaining our forests and conserving what we have of nature, we are deeply indebted to people who are economically worse off than us. And we are indebted to them because they continue to experience energy gaps so that the planet can continue to be able to breathe, and so that we can enjoy the luxuries that we enjoy. And I think women are just, we're socialized to be able to think about all of those things. The one caveat that I would just bring to all of the points that I made is that that's not all that women bring. And I always struggle with this conversation, because I fear that by saying all of the things that I just said, we put women in a box. And I had a board interview where the interviewer was basically trying to box me. So when you join the board, what is the area that you will contribute to? Can you confirm that it'll be just 1, 2, or 3?
And it'll be the gender committee, right? Like,
Right.
yeah.
Exactly. And very gently but firmly, I explained that I would be a fully contributing board member, and I would comment on all things, financial and otherwise. And yes, I bring this vast experience in terms of consumer intelligence and so on, but I would be coming there as a full board member to fulfill all of my fiduciary responsibilities. And also, from my experience, one of the most incredible strategic finance minds I've ever encountered at a board level was a woman. And I would hate to think that someone like her would be constrained to only, sustainability issues. So I think, it's a balancing act. We must acknowledge that there are certain things that women are likely to be good at because of how they are socialized and the different life experiences that they bring, but that also women are full humans and fully participating members at a board level. So it's something that we need to balance very carefully.
Yeah, and I think you're totally right. We do argue and advocate for women on boards and talk about what women contribute, because that's not like that's the thing that boards do not need to be convinced that men need to be on boards, because that's the default. But you're right that it does women a disservice, because the point is gender diversity on boards. Like, if we filled a board only with women, that wouldn't actually tick the box. Like, the box to tick is your board diverse enough to have a range of opinions and perspectives, to be able to consider all possibilities when they're making decisions? It's similar to leadership. So I think you're absolutely right about that. The other thing the literature does is it talks about trends on average, and women are not completely different to men. There's like so much overlap in what we have to offer, and to talk about it on average might actually be assigning women qualities that really limit their participation. I really liked your thoughtful response to that question. I'd love to bring it to a personal level, because you yourself are on a few boards, and I heard a story I'm gonna share with the whole audience now. I heard a story about a board that you're on, Lula, and that board was looking to increase its gender diversity. And the board actually chose to wait on voting for a new board member, even though it was outside of their timeline. They chose to wait until they had a diversity of candidates, including women. And full disclosure, this is one of Women's World Banking's asset management's investee companies. But my understanding is that is how they found you, and I think you're now the board chair of Lula. So now you're in the position to make those decisions. I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation conversations I've had with board members that say we just can't find any women candidates. So what is your advice for boards looking for a diversity of candidates?
Mm. Yeah, that is a true story. I can confirm that. And because we live in very interesting times where I think there can be a kind of resistance to anything that drives diversity, I will start by highlighting this, which I think is a nuance but a very important one. I think what's really brilliant about what Women's World Banking does is they're not saying change the criteria for the role. They're not saying we're going to force you to put a woman in the role. They're saying before you start this process, find a pool of qualified women to be a part of the process. And I think that's really brilliant because what it does is that it helps the organization not default to what is easiest. Because sometimes I think that is the biggest impediment, right? You're most likely surrounded by people like you. You're more likely to just continue doing the same thing that you're doing than anything else. Um, and I think that the way in which they've approached it is incredibly wise and is something that many organizations would do well to imitate. But in the absence of that as a policy, and if you're not an investee of Women's World Banking, I do still think that there is a lot that you can do in the way in which you approach recruiting for your board if you're interested in driving diversity. I think the first thing is just to be intentional, right? And so even if it's not a policy, you can just say to your talent leader or your headhunter, I would like at least X% of the candidates that you present to me to be women, right? So I think intentionality is definitely one. The other thing, people say this, we can't find any women, and I often ask, are you going where women are? So, I've served on the board of organizations that support women across their career life cycle. That's a great place to go. There's a whole bunch of women executives in one place. If you're looking for a female board member, you might just find one there. So I do think that that's important. And then I think at the same time, and this might seem contradictory, but also be willing to just widen the aperture. Just ask people that may seem to you like they might not be the obvious choice, but just tell people we're looking to expand our candidate of women board members, and you might be surprised. So in the case of Lula, what's really funny is that almost simultaneously, I think it was 3 men that approached me and said, hey, would you be interested? And these were all men that I had worked with in different organizations, in different contexts. And they approached me because Lula was being intentional about saying, we are looking for these candidates. So, all of this to say, yes, go to spaces where women are, but women are 50% of the population. The men in your network might know the qualified women too, right? Yeah, so I think those are just some of the things to really think about as you start that go down that road of diversifying your board.
And now, a word from our sponsor. EY applauds Women's World Banking's 45-year legacy empowering women through financial inclusion. Together, we have a common vision to build a better financial services industry, one that is stronger, fairer, and more sustainable. Find out more on ey.com.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes so much sense. Let's shift to talking a little bit more about climate change. At Women's World Banking, we put together a map of climate vulnerability. And listeners, you can check that out at the report I mentioned that you can look up online on finance, climate, and gender. But when we put together this map, Africa was just lit up as being highly vulnerable. Now, you have a bit of a bird's eye view on climate change, given your engagement with multiple organizations that are interfacing with this in one way or another. I'd love to hear, what are you seeing from your vantage point on climate change?
So what I'm seeing is concerning, as you've kind of alluded to already. I think on average, the temperatures are rising much faster on the African continent than elsewhere in the globe. Often people kind of couple this with the reflection that Africa has contributed less, to this disaster than anyone else, which I think is a fair observation. But I also think, it doesn't kind of move us forward, right? The reality that I am seeing on the ground is that climate change is here. And I think it's the UN Secretary General actually who said that, it's an adaptation crisis now, right? And that's really what we need to be focused on. And certainly, if you look right now, it's, some of the flooding that's happening in Nigeria, the displacement of people. And in Africa, the issue is, right, that there's an intersection of sometimes political displacement with climate displacement as well. And the results are awful, right, in terms of refugees, food insecurity, and so on. So those are some of the things which I'm seeing, which really worry me. But I am incredibly encouraged by what is happening at a local kind of grassroots community level in terms of what people are doing. And this is still something I'm trying to really think through around how this is harnessed. But I think that it would be great if more adaptation capital actually flows into local community level, because people are able to do amazing things. So in Kenya, for instance, Kibera, which is their large informal settlement, a grassroots
The
community
biggest
organized.
in Africa, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm. And I mean, lots of people there living in abject poverty, but a local Kenyan NGO community organization has set up aerial water pipes because there's regular flooding, and so that people can continue to have clean water, right? They're looking at, what can they do around riverbanks, getting youth involved, and so on. And I think that that type of initiative is really important. And then I've also liked some of the work that's been happening around kind of your voluntary carbon credits market, where where the benefits accrue to the actual community. And I think when I've been looking at some of that, it's just underscored for me the importance of tools like payments tools, for instance, just to make sure that we're able to track and trace and ensure that the people who are doing these various conservation projects, we can ensure that the benefits really do accrue to those people so that they can improve their livelihoods as well. So at a local and community level, I see huge potential, but underfunded potential. At a macro level, kind of policy, bigger projects, I'm concerned that there isn't enough traction, and I guess the next couple of months will tell whether in the current global context, this will still receive the attention that it requires. But certainly, to my mind, I think for the African continent, alternative financing is increasingly important. And sustainable alternative financing is increasingly important. And I would love to see our leaders really focusing on that a lot more in the coming months and years.
Yeah, and I just wrote something on this, drawing on some research. I don't have the link now, but it's in the report I mentioned. Only 0.01% of climate financing goes towards gender equality, which is stunning to me amid innovations women are participating in. You talked about the voluntary carbon credit market, and a lot of that is going towards consumer decisions that women are making, conservation projects. Women are more likely to be involved in conservation in their communities, and livelihood adaptation for women-led MSMEs, which we haven't talked a lot about, but all of these things are things that gender equality funding in the climate finance realm could really help. And yet only 0.01% of climate financing goes to those really valid and important uses. So I completely agree.
And I will feel terrible if I don't mention this, but I think for our listeners, those who haven't read the work of Wangari Maathai, who was a Kenyan environmentalist, I really encourage people to look at her work, because I think that she was one of the first people years ago who really helped me start to understand this intersection of economic empowerment, gender equity, and the climate. And she brought it together at a time where, I mean, we were still trying to convince people that climate change was really a thing, right? And what she had to say about it, it is incredibly powerful, right? And the way in which those dots connect, and I think it's what you're alluding to as well. So really encourage people to look at some of her work as well.
That's a great call out. Yeah, I also read something of hers quite early on in my own journey understanding this. And maybe we can link to it in the comments here in the YouTube version of this. But listeners, you could just look up Wangari Maathai, whose research is incredible and writing is incredible. I can't believe it's already been a half hour that we've been talking. Buhle, I'd love to come back to you for a final question. One of the responsibilities of exceptional leaders is to send the ladder back down once they've climbed it. So how can the financial sector create more Buhle Goslars in the world?
Yeah. We're assuming that's a good thing, right?
It's a great thing. Come on.
Okay.
But not everybody has parents that tell them they can be president. So how can the financial sector create more of you?
I love my parents. So I think the first thing, maybe going back to where we started, about my parents and my upbringing, I think it's investment in education. My parents were, and this is something that everyone who's a listener can do. My parents were very, very focused on investing in me, despite people saying to them, she's a girl child, why would you do that? They were completely undeterred. I was the beneficiary of scholarships. So corporations that do that, my father is a mining engineer. I benefited from scholarships from Anglo American and others. So corporations and people who do that, it matters. So that's at your basic kind of grassroots, level. Then I think, within the workplace, we spoke about the arc of my career. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention that I benefited from leaders who were willing to take a risk, because as I made each leap, I was often a non-traditional candidate. But I think they were able to see what the skills I was bringing were, and to look at my track record and say, we'll take a chance. So I think as leaders, give those future Buhles a chance. If they're non-traditional, take a risk, right? I think that's that's incredibly important. And then I think, once you in a leadership role, don't as you move, don't leave people behind, in the sense of stay connected to people, share information. I still get calls from people that I led in various organizations wanting to talk through issues of salary equity. What do I think they should do, and so on. And I think keeping that community is really, really important, and especially for women, because we can kind of navigate this career trajectory alone, and you don't need to build community. Speak to people, and for me, I see that as another way of sending the ladder back. And I'll often say to people when they call me for advice, and if it works and they say, oh, that was amazing, I say yes, and remember, you need to pay it forward, right? And so I think those are all things that we can, at an individual or corporate level, that we can all do to help people who have a passion for creating a more inclusive world thrive.
That's great. Thank you so much, Buhle, for joining us. I really appreciate your time today.
That's an absolute pleasure. Thank you. Cheers.
Well, I have so many notes from our conversation, but I just want to share a few, and maybe these are notes that you took as well. First of all, we talked about some innovations in the climate space, water innovation, voluntary carbon credits, conservation projects, livelihood adaptation, which is what the UN is flagging we need to be moving towards. And all of these innovations require finance, and yet only 0.01% of climate finance goes towards gender equality. That's a big gap that we need to think about as an industry filling. So financial services really makes a huge difference in these things. Second, private sector is not solving these challenges at scale. And so there are policy and regulatory approaches that are needed to fill that gap in what the private sector is able to do right now. And the next few months will be really crucial, especially during key moments like COP29. As these key decision makers approach crucial decisions, I urge all of us to get smart on these topics. You can go to womensworldbanking.org and download our recent publication on this, on finance, climate, and gender, but also read people like Wangari Maathai and read things that are coming out on this topic to learn more and see what can be done at this crucial intersection of women's financial inclusion and climate change. Third, I think building the pipeline at all levels is something I came out with here. Just hearing Buhle's own story of her upbringing and early career and kind of winding path emphasizes education, early career investment, the power of networks, identifying and finding women leaders and making sure that they are being considered for positions to increase gender diversity on boards and in leadership. And that's tremendously important. If you have a board you work with or work on or manage, and you're looking to diversify your board, ask somebody in your network to share it with women around them. Or honestly, this is such a passion issue for me. Just email me and I'll suggest some ideas. My email is sk@womensworldbanking.org. Now, if you found today's discussion valuable, don't forget to subscribe, to rate it, to leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback really matters to us and it helps us bring you content that resonates. So please stay engaged, stay informed, and I look forward to connecting with you in our next episode in December. Thank you.